Hello, second grade. Welcome back. I'm glad you've decided to tune in for Tuesday's lesson. I promise it won't be as long as Monday's. This is just kind of a brief uh, lesson to give you an idea of what we're talking about and the idea of comparing and relating. All right. So at this point, we should have a solid foundation about our measurement tools, the units used in these measurement tools, and how to measure objects to get their exact length. All right. Those are the basic things we need to know. And if you don't have a great concept of it yet or a good idea of what we're doing, email me, we'll set up a meeting, and I will get you right where we need to be. All right, but as I was saying, today you're focused on comparing and relating measurements. All right, we're first going to look at measuring two of the same object using both centimeters and inches and relating that, comparing and relating that. And then eventually we're going to kind of have a sneak peek into what you're going to be doing today and tomorrow's activity in Desmos, which will be measuring two different objects in either inches or centimeters and comparing and further relating that. All right, so let's get started. All right, so as I was saying before, the measurement tool and units that we're going to be talking about today or using for the activities and throughout the week basically is the ruler and using inches or centimeters. All right. And so here I provided the example rulers we're going to be using. And it's almost like if a ruler was cut right in half, right? Just so we can use both sides without having to constantly flip it. So here we have our inches side, and then here we have our centimeters. All right, so let's get started. All right, so going back to step one, and we already know how to do this, right? We've talked about measuring. We measured yesterday. We know how to measure. We know that we need to start at 0, make sure it's freaky flat, and then look, stop, look no further, right? So let's do that with this toy car. We're going to measure first in inches, and then we're going to measure it in centimeters. And then we're going to compare and relate the two lengths, okay? So I just click and drag this car. We're going to first start it at 0. All right, and then we see that it stops at exactly 4 inches. All right, next we're gonna bring it down to the centimeters here. Start it at 0. All right, you see that it stops at exactly 7.5 centimeters. All right, we started at 0, we made sure it's freaky flat, we stopped, looked to no further, and came to the conclusion that it's 4 inches or 7.5 centimeters. All right, so let's compare that. All right, so here we can see a side by side that the toy car is 4 inches, or we can say that the toy car is 7.5 centimeters. All right, so now that we know that, how can we relate that? How do we relate this comparison? Let's see. All right, so here we're going to relate the two different measurements, right? We can say the toy car is 4 inches or 7.5 centimeters. It's important we use or because it is the same length in general, right? It's not two different lengths. It's actually the same, 4 inches or 7.5 centimeters, so to say. One's not longer than the other. But how do we further relate that? All right, we can see that since centimeters is smaller than inches, though, right? You see that there's that 1 centimeter is a lot less smaller than 1 inch. Okay, remember we saw that in our first lesson. There are more centimeters than inches for the same length. And we can see that when we compare them, right? We see that there's 7.5 centimeters. 7.5 is a bigger number than 4. Okay, we see that there are more centimeters, right? There's 7.5 to be exact, than inches for the same length, right? This is the same length, but they're two different numbers because there are just more centimeters than inches, okay? This doesn't mean that it's bigger. This doesn't mean that it's smaller. It's the same length, just represented in two different units of measurement. All right, let's do another one. All right, so we're going to go back to step 1. We're going to measure. And here I have a pine cone, okay? So we'll do first in inches. We'll bring it all the way to 0. All right, make sure that it is freaky flat. Follow it. Stop, look no further. We see that this pine cone is 6.5 inches. All right, now let's bring it down here to the centimeters. And we're gonna put it right at the 0 again. Follow it all the way down, making sure it's freaky flat as can be. Yes, it's not a perfectly flat object, but it's as flat as it can be. And then we're gonna stop right here, look no further, and see that it is 12 centimeters. All right, so now that we know the lengths, let's compare. All right, so when comparing the two lengths, all right, we know that the pine cone is 6.5 inches, and we know that in centimeters it is 12 centimeters. All right, and this is a very similar situation to the car. Okay, so how we're going to relate it is going to look a lot like how we relate it to the car. It's just to get kind of an extra practice to really see how we can compare and relate, measuring the same object but in different units of measurement. Okay. Okay, so when we're relating it here, we see that the pine cone is 6.5 inches or 12 centimeters again, right? Because it's the same length. This is the same length, just represented in two different forms of measurement. And we know again that since centimeters is smaller than inches, there are more centimeters than inches for the same length. All right. And we can see that, right? There are 12 centimeters. 12 is a bigger number than 6.5. But that doesn't mean that it's bigger. All right. This doesn't mean that this is a bigger measurement than this one. It's the same measurement, it's the same length, just represented in two different forms of units of measurement. Okay. Because again, inches, we can see that, right? Visually, we can see that inches is bigger than centimeters. 1 inch is larger than 1 centimeter. Okay, so obviously this number is going to be smaller. When we measure an object, it's going to be smaller than if we measured it in centimeters. All right, so let's move on to what we're going to talk about next. All right, so next I'm going to give you a sneak peek into today's activity as well as into tomorrow's Desmos activity and topic. So now, instead of measuring the same objects in two different units of measurement, we did inches and centimeters, we're going to measure two different objects using one unit of measurement, but we'll do both centimeters and inches. So you're going to see that because we're going to do it together, okay? And this is how we can further compare and relate objects and their measurements and see how they relate and how they differ and how they compare. Okay, so let's take a look. All right, so we're going to stick with the pine cone and toy car since we've already done that. Okay, so I call this step 3 kind of continued or further to relate further. All right, so we remember that the pine cone, we're only using inches here. Okay, you can see that both rulers are in inches. You remember that the pine cone is 6.5 inches and that the toy car is 4 inches. All right, so you see that since they're both in inches though, this doesn't mean they're the same length, right? Because they're both in the same unit of measurement. But we can see that one is bigger than the other, right? You can see that 6.5 is a bigger number than 4. And we can even see this visually, right? If we place them next to each other like this, the toy car is smaller, right? Smaller than the pine cone. All right, but by how much? How do we know that? Well, let me show you how. All right, so again, so how can we tell? So if we put the two measurements together, right? So if the pine cone is 6.5 inches, and we know this is the bigger number, we're gonna subtract the smaller number from that. So the toy car, which was 4 inches, to equal 2.5 inches. So what does this number mean? What does 2.5 inches mean? That basically means how much longer the pine cone is to the car. So the pine cone is 2.5 inches longer than the toy car. All right, maybe you're like, wait, how did you get that? How do you even know that? Let me show you. So you can see that even visually by placing these two items together. We can see that 6.5 right here, if we put that on the same one as the toy car, all right, and if we go down, we see how much we can go down. We can go down a half so we can get to a whole number. Then we go down 1, 2. So we just went down 2.5 inches to get to 4 inches, which again is how much longer the pine cone is, right? Because the pine cone is 6.5. It's 2 inches, 2.5 inches longer than the toy car, okay? And that is the basic formula of how you find how much longer something is than another object, right? This would be your equation. You would pick the bigger object, no matter what you're measuring, and subtract it from the smaller number or the smaller length to find out how much longer the bigger object is than the smaller object. And then here you can represent it in a number sentence. All right, this is what you're going to be doing in today's activity. All right, so know it well, okay? So the pine cone is 2.5 inches longer than the toy car. All right, let's do this in centimeters too. All right, so here we know that the pine cone is 12 centimeters and that the toy car was 7.5 centimeters. All right, again, we know that the pine cone is bigger than the toy car. So let's see by how much. So we see here, the pine cone is 12 centimeters, the bigger number, subtracted by the toy car's length, 7.5 centimeters, equals 5.5 centimeters longer. All right, so then we put that into our number sentence and we say that the pine cone is 5.5 centimeters longer than the toy car. All right, and we can see that if we start at 12 and we go down 1, 2, 3, 4, all right, and then we can't go down another whole number. We have to go down half. All right, and we come here and we get 5.5 centimeters. All right, so again, 1, 2, 3, 4. One second. All right, so we can see here again, we can further relate this and know that we're going to take the bigger measurement, 12 centimeters, the pine cone, and subtract the smaller measurement, which was the toy car, 7.5 centimeters, and we get 4.5 centimeters. All right, and then we represent this in a number sentence by saying the pine cone is 4.5 centimeters longer than the toy car. All right, and we know this because we can visually see that the pine cone is bigger, but by how much? And then we can even use the ruler to figure out. All right, we can go down 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a half. All right, so 4.5 centimeters longer than the toy car. Okay. All right, let's talk about what we're going to do this week. All right, so for the rest of today's agenda, I want you to go ahead and watch using and comparing different units to measure an object. Basically, again, just another review of what we talked about in this lesson. You are going to complete the Let's Compare Lengths activity. It's a lot like what we just worked on in this lesson, and that is in Google Forms too on Google Classroom. And again, optional, but you can practice in the extra games I provided, especially on SplashLearn. And then I just want you to be able to tune in for tomorrow's Desmos activity to continue learning why measuring is fun. Alrighty, so I will see you all tomorrow. Please don't hesitate to email or ask me any questions you may have. All right, bye guys.